Welcome to Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be here. So this is episode 11, and we're recording this on May 8th, 2022, which is Mother's Day here in the U.S. So happy Mother's Day, Anita.
Thank you. In today's episode, we take on one of the most pressing concerns for most of the globe, inflation. What has caused the historic rise in the U.S. and what policies can help address it? In particular, we discuss how immigration may be the key to the labor shortage problem and help keep prices down. Additionally, we discuss how the Russia-Ukraine war impacts inflation and why governments should be more frank in how their policies, like sanctions, directly affect consumer prices. Now on to the fun stuff. So, how was your week, Ryan? And is there anything you're looking forward to?
Yeah, no, week was good. Am looking forward to, at the end of the week, which has been a real passion for us since our time in the Netherlands, is Eurovision is coming on. We've been watching kind of the frankly a little bit sad American version for the past couple of weeks. It's okay, but I think it lacks the true spirit of Eurovision, of craziness and just all.
But if you are watching it, vote for Oklahoma and K-pop.
Yeah. They're the only one that really embraced the true vision of Eurovision.
So maybe you should quickly explain Eurovision because not everyone will know what that is.
So Eurovision is an annual song contest that started, I think, in the 1970s and probably began with the original kind of core group of European countries and has since expanded as the EU has expanded. Also includes Israel, includes Russia, although not this year, includes Ukraine. So it's a lot of fun. It's exclusively amateur competitors, or they're amateurs at the time. Very few have actually gone on to big pop star prominence by any means. I think the most famous are ABBA and Celine Dion. There's maybe a handful of others that have kind of like one-hit wonder sort of stuff.
I do want to correct the record, though. They don't have to be amateurs.
They don't have to be amateur, but I think it's rare to see like a professional. But for the most part, anyway, we've watched this off and on since the early 2000s when we were in the Netherlands. And recently started watching probably 3 or 4 years ago. And obviously in the US, I think it's become a lot more prominent after the Netflix movie with Will Ferrell, kind of poking fun at it, but in a loving way, and also capturing kind of that zany, campy wackiness that...
What is the name of that movie? It was pretty well regarded.
Yeah, well, I don't know off the top of my head.
We'll try to put it in the show notes.
Yeah.
And as for pop stars, last year, a rock band from Italy won, which is unusual, but they've definitely made the charts. Not necessarily with the song from Eurovision, which was in Italian, I think, but Begging has been on the hits and is one of my favorite songs.
Yeah, so they were good. I got why they won. My heart was with Ukraine last year before it was cool to be for Ukraine. They had a band called Shum, or Goa was their name, and then Shum. They made it to the finals. I thought it was really pretty badass performance. The lead singer looked exactly like Trinity from The Matrix. Odds on, with the UK betting parlors, the favor is the Ukraine, kind of for sentimental favor. But they constantly put up good performances. Because we watched them win that one year.
And that was one of our favorites. Yep. You think you're being all cool because you liked Ukraine the most last year, but we definitely have liked Ukraine performances.
Yeah, so they're solid. So we're really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be cool. And we are, thanks to Anita's connections, we'll be...
My exclusive.
Yeah, exactly. Very exclusive DC invite to the Italian embassy to watch Eurovision. So it's pretty cool.
But we are excited about doing that for sure. And, being Italian-American descent, yay. So Italian food and drinks.
Yeah, should be good. Should be good.
Okay, so I have a story that is funny to me and is going to out me in some ways. So a lot of people watch TV at night. I tend to read romance novels It's a good way. It's like a TV episode, a little bit longer. They're very, like a lot of generic fiction they're very full of the same tropes. And so large corporations is a big part of the trope, because however could you have these rich billionaires as part of the Cinderella stories? But this one last night had the most crazy specific international trade plot that I've ever read. And I can't stop thinking about it.
Okay.
So the hero wants to take down the company. And so they need to give evidence of corruption to the FBI. Oh, it's his family company, but he thinks his dad killed his uncle, and this is like part of why. So the corruption that they catch is that his father bribes a U.S. senator to write a tariff bill that will get rid of the tariffs on Chinese goods. And they, I know, right? They benefit from this because they buy the stocks ahead of time through a shell corporation. And then when the price rises, because the investors get excited because they're going to have cheaper inputs, then they sell those shares and make a lot of money.
Okay.
All right. So this is so specific. But what I've just never, ever read that. It's not even a great book or anything. But also, one of the things I keep telling you that I don't understand about the tariffs on China is that why don't we just get rid of them? This will not be this big political moment. And in the book, the senator says, how do I even sell this to my own party? No one's really wanting to get rid of tariffs these days. And so the head of the corporation who's bribing him says, Leland, I don't want to tell you how to do your job, but tariffs are like chickens. You can serve them any way you like. If you want more, you say it's for the sake of competition with our global economic rivals. If it's less, it's to spur greater profitability for the private sector and thus stronger economic development. Just say whichever you have to, but never both on the same day. Easy as can be. I was like, that was true. I don't know how that got to be so specific, but anyway, I couldn't get it out of my head.
Yeah, that's pretty specific. I assume this was written shortly after Trump imposed. They were cranking this out in 2018, and they're like, "Oh, this is timely."
She's an indie, so they just independent publisher, but she has several books, so it could be within. But who does that? I mean, I'm telling you, I've read a lot of big corporations in fiction, but just never. Yeah.
They were very specific kind of trade-related example. Okay, well, that's clearly a niche to be filled if you ever want to write your own romance novel.
I don't know that I put political economy in it. Okay, so going on, you wanted to give some responses for a question that you asked on LinkedIn.
Yeah, so this is a follow-up to some of our last episode. We were exploring kind of energy sanctions and the U.S.'s lack of response, or Saudi Arabia's lack of response to increasing quotas. So I basically posed on LinkedIn, why hasn't China really pushed the Saudis to increase these quotas themselves? Basically stipulating China's economy is already reeling from inflation and COVID-related shutdowns. They obviously purchase huge oil and gas volumes from the Middle East and make significant investments. So basically kind of what's holding them back. So we had one response from Nabil, who responded that, he watched a Arab language interview. And basically the reporter framed the question to Saudi officials as, why haven't you been willing to increase oil production despite all the demand and pressure from the U.S.? And they responded that, Saudi Arabia is being pressured from multiple sources and friends, so not just the U.S., because we're trying to hunt and see, what pressure is really being put on China. Didn't really elaborate who was pressuring them, but the two reasons that they gave, are kind of the official line that they say, okay, we're bound by OPEC production agreement, OPEC plus production agreement, and Saudi Arabia isn't unilaterally willing to break OPEC's plus production quotas, although I'm sure they've done that in the past. And then going back to kind of Saudi Arabia's 2030 vision, which is keeping oil prices high in order to build up kind of that cash and sovereign wealth fund to transition out of, the dependence on oil. So obviously they're keeping a pretty strict party line. Other responses kind of went along the line of, and this is very common within the industry, so the oil industry, that Saudi Arabia actually can't bring this production on, that they've been lying for years about the spare capacity, that the reserves are where the reservoirs themselves have lost a lot of energy. They're in a significant decline, and they've just been bluffing kind of this whole time.
So they're not producing as much as at their highest rate that they have produced before.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. Yeah, they're definitely not near their all-time highs, but they've always alluded to that, hey, we have 1 million in spare capacity that we can bring back, if markets become overheated and we're worried about the demand for our product crashing over time.
I was reading something the other day that was just talking about how the OPEC countries, including Saudi Arabia, have really good relationships with Russia as well.
Yeah, they definitely do. And I think that's definitely a pull factor. But I would just think that China, being the gigantic consumer, and if you look ahead towards the future, being a far more important partner, especially as the U.S. kind of pulls out of the Middle East, that they would sway. But obviously, China doesn't want to undermine Russia either. But I would think China's national interest and economic interest still align with more oil production if the Saudis could do it. So others are around, and I think this kind of ties in that maybe China was rejected privately and, to save face, it wasn't made kind of this sort of public event. And it could be that Saudis really don't have that spare capacity to bring to the market, and they don't want to be exposed as such. But I'm hoping, we can line up maybe a future interview with an expert kind of in the region to really kind of flesh that out. Because I think just in general, understanding China's growing power and relationships in the Middle East is a good thing to explore further.
Yeah, and it's a relatively new topic in the literature. A lot has been written about China and Africa, and more is being written about China and Central Eurasia because of the BRI. But I think more recent topics have included the Middle East and Latin America. But I think the research doesn't go back very far because these are newer relationships that China is still establishing, right? So the idea that the relationship would go beyond just the pure oil purchases. So beginning to our main topic on the drivers of inflation and immigration policy, we wanted to talk about first, I guess, the main drivers of inflation in the U.S. and globally. It has to just be said up front that this is a huge political problem in most of the world. The UN has reduced its forecast for global economic growth due to inflation. It's hit many of the developed countries very hard. And of course, it's hit developing countries much, much harder. So when we talk about the causes of inflation, we have to look at these drivers that are, international in nature, that are driving up inflation everywhere. So one of the natural concerns is stagflation. And to understand that, it's not just inflation, it's wages go up, driving up prices, and you kind of have that circle that happens. That's one of the bad things about when you get on these inflation cycles. Even though wages are going up, purchasing power is going down because inflation is going up higher, but it's still driving up prices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a phenomenon, obviously, the world hasn't really seen since the 1970s and early 80s. And, a lot of economists think that we're not going to see the sustained period that was driven from the oil crisis in the 70s, just because the economy, the global economy in general, is a lot less dependent on fossil fuels as kind of the key driver to so many inputs into products and services and things. The other aspect that they point to as maybe cushioning is household savings, particularly in the US and maybe to a lesser extent Western Europe, are in really good shape. I mean, savings rates went way up during the pandemic. So the thought is, and that's honestly the only thing that's kind of shaping or helping the economy is consumer spending. So that's going to allow for some cushioning with the higher prices. And then for the EU itself, it's been able to subsidize some of the impact from energy costs that are the big inflation driver over there.
Right. I don't know how long they're going to be able to do that. And so one of the things that's changed in the inflation discussion is, at first it was very focused on COVID and supply chains. And as everyone will remember, we couldn't get them off the shipping docks. Warehouses had been closed across the world. And that still is one cause. But the optimism was once we finally, get all this back inventory and, there's less lockdowns due to COVID and such, that was the optimism that inflation would essentially go away. But now with the war in Russia, Ukraine, there's some optimism that inflation rate won't continue to be as high, but the drivers now are largely energy and food prices, and there's no real optimistic outlook that those could change. I thought a couple things that were interesting when it came to the war was that it's well known that Russia and Ukraine supply, I think, up to 30% of wheat and certain grains. But the UN and some other sources were saying that the main culprit behind the spike is the global shortage of fertilizer. Russia and Belarus provide about 40% of the world's exports of potash.
Potash, yep.
Yep, a potassium-rich salt critical to much of the global fertilizer and agriculture production. But what I also didn't know is that this itself is being targeted by the U.S. and its allies with economic sanctions. So the sanctions themselves are causing this really critical deficit in fertilizer because you can't plant crops if you don't have fertilizer. The food prices right now are at the highest recorded levels, the jump, which was up 34% from last year. Obviously, this hurts the developing world, instability in Africa. I saw a lot of in Asia, particularly because they get more of their wheat directly from Russia and Ukraine. But what I really want to emphasize, when some of these sanctions, we have to think about the pros and cons. And if you are targeting this particular ingredient in fertilizer, that is going to cause global instability.
Yeah, that's wild. That's wild. I mean, so we had the carve-outs for energy specifically, which are being kind of revisited by Europe. But nevertheless, it was like, hey, this is going to be so destabilizing, particularly for rich European countries, that we got to carve this out. But to have one targeting, so they aren't targeting like wheat exports from Russia for sanctions too, are they? I mean, that's a great point that, this affects agriculture production. I was reading, the UN's predicting kind of huge increases in starvation levels in these countries that are impacted. But to target something specific like this, that's kind of crazy.
I just kind of found that statistic today, or read about it today, but I assume that it may not even be specific. It may just fall under all the other sanctions.
Well, yeah, but you want to have a carve out for something that's as critical as energy, arguably. I mean,
right. So I think that's really problematic. And I think, like I said, I don't know if the government should definitely be thinking through like these individual goods. And then, how much revenue does Russia really get from this?
Yeah, that's what I would think. I would think whatever they get from potash sales, it pales in comparison to the oil exports. I mean, if you're going to target one, target oil would arguably have less of a humanitarian impact, potentially, than potash.
For sure, particularly when you talk about oil. But natural gas is another reason that food prices are going to go up, or are going up, because they are needed to make fertilizer. Mm-hmm. So I definitely think that, to have sanctions policies to be effective, they have to be tailored. And something that is causing starvation and hardship around the world, let alone our own inflation, political problems, should definitely be addressed. I don't think that they will be, but I don't understand why not.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm guessing, because we talked about this before, farmers in other locations like the US can't shift their crops fast enough to kind of expose to that. Same with potash. Potash actually comes up quite a bit just because some of the oil fields that I look at work in the private sector have huge potash areas that are actually, you have to take special provisions when drilling in those areas. But a huge part of like New Mexico and Texas have these big potash reserves. I don't know if it's like rare earth minerals where it's just environmentally
I think there's some
issues.
symbiotic relationship between. I read this kind of quickly, but I do think that there's a reason why they tend to be in areas where there's also oil.
Okay. Yeah. No, it's interesting, but yeah, I don't think they can respond so quickly in terms of like increasing production of potash, like from the US to respond to shortages. But we might understand it better.
Right. That's something that, it doesn't seem like you can grow a lot more of in a quick amount of time. And then when you talk about shifting crops, you also are seeing like rice and other alternative grains because people are seeking alternatives. So that's right. So that's increasing the prices there. And then, of course, there's a way that all these feed into, when you have prices of wheat and rice, it's just 40% of your grocery store alone.
Yeah, and especially in developing countries. I mean, that's a huge part of the diet. So when that increases significantly, then it'd be devastating.
So on one hand, I want to emphasize that the effects are worse in developing countries. But when we talk about the United States, the Financial Times had this really good tracker of inflation, and they show that by far the highest goods that are affected by inflation are energy and food. So when we talk about consumer prices going up, we're not talking about across the board. And food is a major component of that. So, these are things that I wish that people understood. And I don't know why governments don't make, better the connection of this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it. But you should know this is also going to mean how you have to pay for things.
Yeah. Yeah. They definitely didn't communicate. I mean, in very vague terms, they sort of alluded to that this is going to require some suffering, but not the specifics. And to be fair, it's probably hard to estimate what the exact impact of these provisions were going to be.
But the FT, maybe in the future, but the FT, you can see the statistics looking at the increased inflation of the prices of food compared to other goods.
No, you can see that now, but I'm saying beforehand to be able to say, okay, your grocery store bill is going to go up 15% over the next 2 months because we're going to.
You don't have to be that specific. That also brings up two things. So while we're talking about, or as we go in to talk about policies, the number one tool countries use, and pretty much their only tool in terms of if we're thinking about direct effects, is monetary policy. And so that's why you're seeing them raise interest rates, which encourages people to save more, people to spend less. And if people are spending less in the economy, then prices will go down. But it's never been done at these rates without a recession. So the problem is, when you look at the causes, when you're looking at war as a cause of inflation and kind of in these very specific sectors, food and energy, then a lot of people are wary that that's an actually good solution and that it might just cause a lot of economic problems going forward without solving the problem in any way. Because if you can't control prices on food.
I think that's why they've taken a modest path in terms of the rate increases.
But they've never increased by 2 quarters, half a point. They've never done that before without a recession following. Never. So, the idea is you bring prices down, but if that's not the cause of prices going up, then how much are you really controlling inflation? They can't prevent the increase in food prices, and they can't prevent the increase in energy prices. What they will is deflate the rest of the economy.
Yeah, I think it is a difficult thread to kind of go through. But again, they don't have a lot of choice in terms of, like you said, that's the only tool within their bucket. And also, I thought there was still showing for non-core inflation, still significant in terms of both from the labor market and from government stimulation and policy. So it's not all just tied to energy and food prices. Moreover, you'll see over the next 12 months, energy markets respond by bringing more volumes onto the market. And that will even allow, I think, agriculture to respond over time for certain inputs. But yeah, I agree. It definitely, I think the recession threat for this year went from 5-10% in January to about a third to 40% chance this year. So we have an active bet going on, Anita and I do, where I bet that there wasn't going to be a recession this year, and she did. I'm now sweating a lot because U.S. obviously had the surprise negative quarter for Q1, all driven by the decrease in federal government spending and private sector spending. The only thing kind of keeping it somewhat afloat, like I mentioned before, was consumer spending. But yeah, we already have one quarter in the bag. So if Q2 is negative too, then I lost that bet.
Well, and you increase interest rates, and that is supposed to prevent consumer.
Oh yeah,
that's why you have recessions.
That's going to put and obviously consumer sentiment is very low, like the lowest it's been in probably since 2008, if I had to guess.
Yeah, so you're just hoping for some kind of technicality for you to win.
Exactly. That's why I stipulated all that in the bet.
But I was taking account to all those factors. I'm just looking at the Financial Times tracker right now, and it's hard to tell exactly. Like I have to look at the specific data, but all items, non-food or non-energy, are up, but much lower. So it looks like overall, or this is the U.S., less than 5%.
Oh, so less than 5% is non-core. That's a lot. 5% out of the 8% inflation?
Like I said, I'm just guessing from their graph, but it's still way less. You have energy, which is, seen 30%. Food is over 10%. I think it's like at 14% now.
Yeah, but a lot of it, like just looking at the U.S. and the bucket of goods that are in there, monetary policy and government policy have obviously had a significant inflationary effect, particularly in the US and in the UK, where huge stimulus packages and significant quantitative easing has taken place over the last 2 years. It's driven up, obviously, equity prices, driven up real estate through the roof. So all these are huge inflationary factors as well.
So that's very contentious. So basically...
Well, yeah, look at that same FT chart and compare different European countries to the UK, compare like France to the UK, compare...
Germany is higher than the UK. I'm looking at it right now. Germany is near the United States.
Yeah, that's only recently because of energy. Energy prices have had an outsized, but look at before the Ukraine war and compare it to the UK. And then compare France to the UK or the US.
It's still pretty high, though.
Yeah, it's high, but it's a good 2 or 3%. So most economists think that the stimulus packages have added probably...
Not most economists.
Even left-wing economists think that it adds a good 25% of the inflation that we're seeing, so around 2% in the U.S., is due to the stimulus packages, both from the Trump administration, which is $3 trillion pumped in the economy, and then $2 trillion from the recent Biden bill.
Okay, I looked into the data when you put that in there.
It came from PolitiFact. Come on, this is like validated stuff. I'm not just like making this up.
Right. So there are 2 or 3 things about that. When that was like a single economics professor who really put that out, but it did conform to expectations. Now, those figures came out in April of 2021. And the prediction was then inflation would be back at normal levels by the end of 2021 because of the stimulus no longer being part of the market. Other people have done studies looking at statistical significance of inflation in the United States and European countries. Now, to do that, you have to normalize the amount of normal inflation each country experiences, right? So if you have a country that has a lot of price stability in general, then that is statistically taken into account. where the US has a lot more fluctuation. The point is, when you normalize those things, then there's no statistical difference between these European countries, the United States, and the UK.
Okay. I'm sticking with PolitiFact and the fact that some left-wing economists also acknowledge, which I think is reasonable, when you pump an additional $2 trillion, actually $5 trillion into the economy, that's going to have some sort of inflationary effect.
And I'm saying if to the extent it did, it was minor and has been out of the system long before now.
It's been out of the system.
People no longer have those checks for
it's not just those checks. It's the quantitative easing that also went with it. That all drove up. I mean, everything that's allowing corporations and businesses to borrow money, to inflate asset prices, that's all still in there. And all the infrastructure stuff, that's only slowly being dripped into the economy. All of that hasn't been spent. It isn't in the economy yet.
Yes. Well, I mean, if that was a more significant amount, then people would see it and feel better.
It was 1.9 trillion, but...
Over like 20 years?
No, over like 10 years at most.
I mean, the problem is people wouldn't even see that money in the economy for years. Well, I'm also going to put on our website or in the show notes this study that looked at whether it's significantly different than European countries. Right. Because your argument rests on the fact that we can say this is a cause because it's different. Our inflation rate is different than Europe.
Yeah, it's different between the Anglo-American countries that took the approach during COVID to provide large amounts of quantitative easing and direct stimulus through printing money. And I think all central banks, the European Central Bank, the Japanese, have also taken around debt and around monetary policy, have taken very different approaches compared to the 1970s and 1980s.
I don't think it goes back that far. But if you look
you just said it goes back like several decades. And that's the only place where inflation actually differed between EU, let's say Western developed countries.
Yeah, so...
But, a lot of economists disagree, so I get your point. There are definitely economists that are like, no, this had zero impact. Larry Summers, a lot of others were like, this is going to have a huge inflationary impact. So me personally, I feel
wrong.
Like...
That's also predisposed. No, he's almost always wrong.
But to say that, your opponents are always wrong or don't have a point. I think inflation, it definitely has some factor. I'm going to lean on like a quarter of it.
I think absolutely not in 2022. 100%. I think that is not in 2022.
And I don't are lagging. And when that package was passed in 2021, so it hit the economy in 2022.
I do not think that you can prove that.
Well, all of this is very difficult to prove in economics. I think the PolitiFact kind of acknowledges that there's retroactive looks because all the confounding factors, the fact that you had a major war breakout, that you have all the COVID supply, you still have all the issues in China around shutting down the supply chain. It may be impossible to show.
So you're saying that you are basing your argument just on what economists think.
You're also basing it on spurious economic assumptions too. But I think going forward, it'll be difficult to glean out. This would be like, what impact did it have prior to the war in Ukraine, where inflation was still running prior at like 6% in the US?
So one thing I want to talk about is the different causes, right? So a lot of the supply chain kinks have been worked out. You no longer have, all the ships off the docks where they couldn't, get them into...
you don't have the US issues. Yeah.
Right? And in a lot of places in the world. So yes, you do still have some driven by China because of Chinese lockdowns, but not to the extent as you did before, and certainly not the same problems, just getting, shipping items. So what I'm saying is that was a very high driver of inflation, before it still exists some, but one of the reasons why inflation did not fall, like a lot of people were predicting lower inflation because once those kinks got out of the system. But when you have a war, you see the slope actually increase, which is always important. It increased because of energy and food prices.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree that inflation has accelerated because of the war.
So a major cause of it right now is the war.
Oh yeah. No, I'm saying this multi-factor driven. And I was just making the point that part of it is stimulus
You
related.
keep saying is. I would say may, but there's a lot of contentious facts because basically everyone is saying, oh, this is what we think.
Yeah, that's what economists do. They build models and then they stipulate on those models and they assign a percentage of what it is. But these are obviously very complicated sort of factors that.
But I'm saying the economists aren't building these models. What you're basing this on.
Okay, well, I don't know what studies then that, these PolitiFact citing then, if they're not economic models from economists that they cite. Anyway, do we want to move on to around labor markets? Because I know you had a lot.
So the Financial Times also has an article about one reason also that the UK and the US inflation rates may differ so much from Europe is that they have historically tight labor markets. So the US has never been in a situation where there are nearly 2 jobs per every unemployed person. The UK is not that high, but it's very similar. So the Financial Times thinks that this may actually be one of the most influential causes of the reason why the UK and US inflation is higher than Europe, right? So here I wanted to talk about some of the problems when you have essentially 2 jobs for every one unemployed person. It means that certain sectors of your economy are going to suffer because they can't find labor, right? I mean, the labor is simply not there. So you're having trouble finding just bodies to take care of the elderly. So there was a great story. I think it was one of the NPR podcasts, but it was just talking about how, in elder care, these jobs are not fun jobs and it's hard to ever get a US citizen to do it. And so they rely a lot on immigrant labor. A lot of those who have specialties in medicine that they can't use in the United States, but the immigration is not there and so the costs get much higher, right? And so these are some of the things that you see people also contend with in the labor market. Even their ability to participate is because they're taking care of older parents. And to do that either costs a lot more money than it did before the pandemic, or they are having to do it themselves. So you also can't have, there's construction and there's tech parts of the economy too, but you can't build certain things unless you have enough employees to do it. So you have 2 problems. One, wages are going up, but there's a lot of inequality. And the problem we have now is that wages are not covering inflation. But also, again, you just don't have the ability to, we talk a lot about onshoring and supply chains. But one, no one ever acknowledges, one, how much higher the price of goods are if you do that. And 2, you have to have a labor supply, not just a cheap labor supply. You have to have a labor supply. No one is going to build their business if there's not going to be enough people there for them to hire.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's an interesting point. The fact that, because, I think of the labor market situation, I think of it more as, the inflationary driver, but you're saying it's also potentially preventing the growth of both new businesses, kind of startups. So would expect to see a decline in new startups because of the lack of workers, but then also the inability of businesses to actually invest in growing because they have a lack of workers as well.
That's exactly what we've seen in the market. And productivity numbers are complicated, but we saw a huge decrease in productivity numbers for the last quarter.
Right. I think that's interesting. And I think, there really is a kind of a compelling case that didn't exist necessarily before around low-skilled labor, bringing that into the country, because that's where you do have a big gap. I mean, it is both across high skill and low skill, because part of the impact of COVID is you've had a lot of older workers retire early. People think that's either due to the fact that, again, because of the inflation and asset prices, that they're able to retire early based on the value of their houses and stock market, but also health fears, keeping them out of the market permanently. So you see this permanent loss of workers that are not coming back.
And you've also lost the immigrants, right? I mean, you
Yeah,
essentially
because of the
closed the
yeah.
border for a couple of years. No one knows the exact numbers because the government says it also hasn't been able to collect numbers due to like COVID. So I'm telling you, it's not just policies. I want to talk about the immigration system itself. But so no one knows for sure, but people are certainly making the case that we would normally just have 1.9 to 2.9 million more workers due to immigration.
Right, which would make up, for a good chunk of that 3 million gap that we're seeing kind of within the labor market.
It's also important because we're not keeping up with population growth, and that's a big problem for economic growth more generally. But this is a more immediate problem. You don't want this sort of market. It's bad on a lot of areas of the economy, particularly inflation. So one of the things that I wanted to bring into focus and think about, like we say that the government only has control over monetary policy. That's what I was taught in political economy from the time I was an undergrad. But when we think about international policies, I mean, there are things depending on what the driver of inflation was. So a lot of the theories about inflation in the 70s were purely energy or derived from, I don't know, monetary. But when you have these causes, this is historic. We have not really had a period in the past where you've had this tight of a labor market. One of the reasons why you haven't had this tight of a labor market is because we had very healthy flows of immigration.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I do want to play devil's advocate. I wanted what the common kind of refrain from immigration and kind of its impact on the labor market and particularly on the American worker and why this sort of argument has gotten so much traction, particularly on the right, but also has a lot of sympathizers on the left. They're more for there just need to be more unions in order to take power back from the capital class. But, one of the economists that was kind of embraced by Trump, and frankly, he was a little bit insulted by it, but he's a Harvard-trained economist, Borjas, he does agree that there is a net benefit that the U.S. has seen in accepting kind of these more low-skilled immigrants. But it's really focused around where those gains have gone. And those gains, he argues, have gone exclusively to the elites within American society and to the immigrants themselves, who obviously get the jobs. But it's really the low-skilled workers who've seen their wages until very recently stagnate and decline relative to where they were in the 1970s. And that's a well-recognized phenomenon. So it's a very similar argument that we've had about before around trade in general. Instead of trade of goods and capital, this is around trade of labor, movement of labor. But regardless of the gains coming from immigration policy, from trade policy, or from automation, there has to be more equal distribution of those gains. And that's really what's lacking.
Through trade. Now,
and labor.
Because since he came out with this, I can find automatically 20 different articles just looking at Google Scholar that directly looked at his study and showed that his was a very formal model rather than data-driven, and show both model theoretically, both quantitative data and several case studies to show that this simply isn't the fact. So in his theoretical model, the idea is that they're equal substitutes, so that low-skilled immigrants are competing with low-skilled native workers. So that's what we call substitutes. One should be a substitute for the other. And so then you would have direct competition. But that, in truth, has not ever really, that hasn't shown to be the case. And that you actually see, like when women entered the workforce en masse, which was also thought was going to drive down wages, which it did not, is we find out that you don't have these simple substitutes. And so that actually, the only one whose wages have been affected by more immigration are other immigrants, where they compete for the same type of jobs. But you have not seen immigration itself have a reduction in wages on lower wage jobs. And the other part of this is it allows for economic growth, right? Because you have more workers who are buying stuff, right? Who are becoming part of the economy, who children go to school and they start their own businesses. The statistic of the new businesses that are like, I don't know, maybe are very, very high. And certainly some of the most, Elon Musk is a immigrant. So it's not that uncommon.
He's not a low-skilled immigrant, I'll say that.
Well, he's not low-skilled. That is true. But you do see, a lot of times it's their children who go on as well. But basically, you do not see this substitute effect. You see an increase in economy effect. So it can always be a little bit confusing when we just look at quantitative data. Quantitative data is really important because it shows you can deal with confounding factors and you can deal with age and education and all these other things. But there have been definitely several case studies of specific areas where immigrants moved into a local area. There was a huge spike and what that did to the economy. So the one I'm most familiar with, NPR's Planet Money, a long time ago, it was about this one town whose population doubled when there was a massive amount of Cuban immigration. And instead of these wage decreases, you just saw like a huge growth of the economy in general. I've also written about refugees, which are a slightly different issue, and the huge factor of economic growth per immigrant, per refugee. And refugees actually cost more money because you're having to provide them with the tools to integrate into society, where immigrants are just kind of left on their own. So we can see that in microcosm. I was trying to pull up the exact, because the Financial Times article had a lot of case studies that I haven't seen. So we bear this out in the quantitative data and in case studies. Those are all too based on if you have a problem of normal unemployment numbers, right? There's no question in anybody's mind that you need immigrants when you have such a tight labor market.
Oh, yeah.
So even in that discussion you had, so a lot of people say a lot of the economic growth we had through the 2000s is, because we had a lot of immigration during that period.
I don't know that economic growth was that great during the 2000s. People would explain that as anemic and driven mostly by real estate speculation. And then following the crisis, the growth was pretty anemic up through 2015, 2016, and then kind of recovered somewhat to more normal levels. But yeah, the U.S. went from an annual growth of 3%, and then following the Great Recession in 2008 was on a permanent path at 2%. So I would hardly call that robust. We're pointing towards immigration as it.
What are you comparing it to? What? That was
the
a pretty
80s and 90s were far superior growth periods.
All right, there's severe recessions in both of those decades.
Not the 90s.
Yeah, that's why George H.W. got voted out of office.
Yeah, wrongly. The economy had recovered by the time the election rolled around. But critically, that first quarter and the year before the election was somewhat anemic, although we would trade that for a lot of the bad periods we've had lately. So I want to go back to...
I was going to pull out numbers.
Get it around immigration. What numbers?
Real fast. I just want to show... So looking at the government's own data from the Homeland Security, you can go on their site and they will have all kinds of numbers that break immigration down. You see immigration levels fall to half of what they were in 2000. And you also see a similar decline in just people who are legalized. So that includes giving green cards and such, which is also interesting. One of the problems in the labor market that was in this podcast by NPR was that because of the immigration office being closed, that the people with green cards couldn't get their extensions on time. So they were forced to not work, right? Companies were forced to let them go. And the one policy Biden administration has done is that you have a temporary extension of 500 days till they can get through their backlog. And this is one of the problems with just even bringing immigration levels back to normal, let alone getting the number of immigrants that we need, is because of these backfills and shortages. Now, everyone talks about the lack of immigration reform. Important, difficult, really difficult problem. I mean, George W. Bush can't get it done, and I was like, nobody's going to get it done then. But there are lots of ways you could take the existing structure and process more immigrants. There had been a chronic lack of judges way before coronavirus to hear these cases. When immigrants apply for asylum, it's often years before their case is even heard from a judge. So we need more people. Border Patrol, they need more people. We need to be filling these positions in our immigration system.
Well, I mean, I think the right would absolutely agree and say that we need more border patrol agents, and the border needs to be secure before any sort of talk about immigration.
No, I think everyone knows the border is secure because there have been almost no immigrants. I mean, I don't think anyone can discuss that. But
well, I mean, the situation on the border is a mess currently. I mean, there are a lot of refugees seeking entry because they think the Biden administration will be more lenient.
Well, no, since Trump, they've been, because of Title 42.
Mexico handled it under Trump. I mean, that was the...
What I'm saying, actually, no, because Title 42, that there's the same program that was stopped briefly under the Biden administration, which says all asylum seekers stay in Mexico. And so you have these border, shanty towns.
Right, but you've seen a huge surge in the numbers at the border since the Biden administration started because they expect to get more lenient treatment than they would under a Trump administration. I mean, it makes sense why you would see a huge increase.
You don't see increased apprehensions. There's no increased illegal immigration, and the border's been shut. Basically, and that's one of the contentious issue, is when Biden is set to lift Title 42. Title 42 is this obscure law that a lot of legal scholars question that says for health reasons, you can close the border and make those asylum seekers go in a third country. Here's the deal on asylum. Law in general is that international law requires that countries accept asylum seekers, but they can decide on what the basis of people who get admitted. So, but the part of the law is that you don't send them to a third party country, is that they are able to reside in your own country. The problem has been with the system, 99% show up. But the problem with the system is, these people aren't even getting hearings for, 2 years or so. So one of the main problems is just people on all sides of it. One of the problems that the Border Patrol complain about is it's not that they need more people to protect the border, is that they end up having to deal with all these, immigrants who just go up to them and say, we're seeking asylum. And they're like, that's not part of our job. But we don't have enough people on all levels of the system. Heck, refugees is a whole huge problem too. All these programs are understaffed, underfunded, and it's kind of inexplicable. It's a matter of will in some sense. I don't think there's anything stopping Biden from, making these increases.
Yeah, and you would think that would take some of the, of course, Republicans have plenty of ammo going into the midterms with, but, this is one of their more popular issues. They'll make up stuff, but at least don't give them things to point at.
Well, and that's what Democrats are so worried about. But there's, the CDC, everyone has ruled there's no real legality of keeping out right now for health reasons, keeping out immigrants.
Right. But you're saying they don't have the manpower to deal with if they did in Title 42.
I'm saying that they don't have enough. These claims would be processed more efficiently if they had more immigration judges, if they had more people there to process the asylum seekers, all of that. And they don't have that. And it is frustrating because when you hear the debates, so, one thing about Democrats, they don't want to hear about caravans and migrants and such, which I don't think is going to be the main issue at all. As always, Americans' approval of immigration, most of them are actually quite high. It's just, the 30% that ties with the Republican Party that have strong feelings about it. But, the debate is around like, oh, we can't do this until we have immigration reform. And that is really important. But there's so many things that could be done just, with funding that could solve a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I think they probably should take advantage while they have any political power, because I think any sort of immigration issues, even around legal immigration, I think is increasingly attacked by Republicans. So I think there's honestly, without significant majorities of Democrats in the Congress, there's no immigration reform period on the table.
I don't think so either. So I think that's why I'm saying that you can take the existing institutions and at least make them better. That's my point. Is the political reality of giving immigration reform is badly needed, but you can do things within that just based on current rules. And the thing is, Republicans, more and more they continue, the worse it's going to be for the economy. Prices, people being able to participate in the workforce, it's a huge drag. You can't build industries, you can't build businesses here.
Yep. No, I think it's a good point. Okay, so is that an episode?
I think that's an episode.
I
think that was a lot of material, and I hope it's useful. I think these are the issues that everyone's talking about, and that the causes are kind of complicated. And so I hope that helped give everyone some more perspective.
Yeah, no, I think you made really good points on immigration as one of the inflation drivers. I'm surprised like the small business, constituencies aren't kind of pounding on the table on, you need to get this resolved or in Title 22 or make it easier so that we can bring in, because they're hurting. They're trying to keep prices as flat as possible for consumers, but
there is political pressure to do that. The counter to that sometimes is that business owners are people, and so they don't always have full understanding of the actual economic situation or, sort of the benefits of immigration. But there has been a lot of pressure from small business groups to open the doors to immigration, for sure. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kellogg'sglobalpolitics and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me at AR Kellogg. And I also want to add that I just created a Facebook page as well. So if you are on Facebook, like our page and keep up with all the updates. It is also called Kellogg's Global Politics.
Yeah, good addition. So you can also reach us by email as usual, Anita at kellogglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan, at kellogglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see the show notes for all the articles that we discussed in this episode and leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast provider. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.